Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next to last webinar in our 2023 forestry webinar series. I'm Lane Mosier. I'm an education program specialist with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. Joined today by Hannah Panci and Rob Croll with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, going over their climate vulnerability assessment. Hannah and Rob, I'll just pitch to you.
Which Lane? Ujuga Kenawia, Robert Dijanakas, Gawini and the Demosine, Philadelphia, and Dunjaba, Anishinaabe, Aki, and Gichimokaman, and Indian Dao, GLIFWC, and Indanoki. My name is Rob Croll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I'm originally from the Philadelphia area. I've been working for GLIFWC for about 5.5 years. I work in the Division of Intergovernmental Affairs, and my background is environmental law and policy. I'm not a scientist, but sometimes I play one on Zoom. I'll let Hannah introduce herself, and then we'll go right into the presentation today.
Yep. Good morning, bonjour, everybody. Hannah Panci and Dijanakas, Ironwood, Michigan, and Dunjaba, GLIFWC, and Indanoki, Gawini and Dudu Damasi. My name is Hannah Panci. I'm a scientist in the climate change program. So I'm in the Biological Services Division at GLIFWC. I've been there for about 8 years now, working on all things climate change. We have a plant phenology study, this vulnerability assessment, and some seed collection efforts. So if anyone is interested in those other projects as well, feel free to reach out to me.
So you'll notice Hannah and I both introduced ourselves in Ojibwe Moan. Neither of us is tribal members, but we try to use the language as much as we can and as much as we know for a number of reasons. One of our missions at GLIFWC is to infuse Ojibwe culture and perspective into everything that we do. We recognize that language is the foundation of culture. Our member tribes are very engaged in revitalizing and reacquiring, in some cases, their language, and we want to support that as much as we can by normalizing the use of the language of this place as much as we can. The title of our vulnerability assessment in Ojibwe is Aanji-bimaadiziimagak, which loosely translated means the world is changing. And there's no value judgment there. It's just a recognition that the world is changing and that people and the beings that we share this world with are going to have to adapt to those changes. If I can get my screen to change here. There we go. So before we start, we got to kind of do some legalese. In the vulnerability assessment and in this presentation, we share TEK that was given to us by Ojibwe tribal members under the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. This knowledge that they shared with us is owned by the individual knowledge holder, and permission for us to use it or share it can be rescinded or withdrawn at any time. It's not the property of GLIFWC. And we're going to share some audio clips in this presentation with the permission of the speaker or their family. Permission for recording hasn't been given, so I'm going to ask Lane when we get to those places where we have audio clips, if he'll just please stop recording during that time, and then we'll tell him when he can start recording again. This is just to honor the wishes of the people who shared information with us. Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is an intertribal natural resource agency. We exercise authority delegated to us by our 11 Ojibwe member tribes. You can see their seals on the right side of your screen there, to implement federal court orders and interjurisdictional agreements related to their treaty rights. GLIFWC was formed in the early 1980s as a direct result of the LCO versus Wisconsin case, in which the Ojibwe tribes' treaty rights in the 1837 and 1842 treaties were reaffirmed. In that decision, the court held that the tribes had the right to co-manage the resources of the ceded territories and regulate their conduct of their members when off reservation, which is really huge. because in public law 280 states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, the state holds criminal jurisdiction on reservation, but the tribes have the ability to regulate the conduct of their members when they're exercising treaty rights off reservation. And that really is kind of a big deal when you think about federal Indian law. This is the area that we work in. The ceded territory boundaries are delineated with the thick black line. The red areas are the individual reservations. We'll talk about that a little bit. You notice that some of these look like they're fairly significant chunks of uninterrupted land, but they're really broken up and checkerboarded because of prior government action that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then you'll note on the other side of the screen is just one of the sections of the 1837 treaty, which specifically calls out that the Ojibwe people were reserving their rights, their pre-existing rights, to continue to hunt, fish, and gather within the territory they were ceding to the United States. Let me reemphasize that. These rights aren't something that were granted by treaty. They were rights that pre-existed the United States, that the tribes always had, that they were able to maintain for themselves while negotiating the treaties. We're just going to do a quick timeline here, kind of a 20,000-foot overview of how treaty rights work in this area of the country, recognizing that there are a lot of different tribes, 574 federally recognized tribes. Treaties are all different. Some tribes don't have treaties. Some tribes don't have rights that go along with their treaties. But since time immemorial, Ojibwe people live by what we now call the seasonal round. Gathering, hunting, and fishing, moving across the landscape to different places at different times of the year to be able to access different resources. Also recognizing that when things changed in one area because they inhabited a very large 60,000 square mile area of land, they were able to move. And now that we have the reservation system in place and treaty rights are attached to a specific location, geographic location, that mobility isn't there anymore. In the 17 and 1800s, Europeans began to settle in the Great Lakes. This area was already home to a number of different tribal nations. The Ojibwe were coerced into signing treaties with the United States government through threat of war or threat of removal out of their homelands. And these treaties forced them to cede their lands and to live on reservations. But again, as I noted earlier, they retained their existing rights to hunt, fish, gather, and other usual privileges of occupancy in the lands that they ceded to the United States. Mid-1800s through the mid-1900s, the newly formed states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota started regulating hunting and fishing, and people began to get prosecuted and jailed for practicing their treaty rights off reservation and even supporting themselves on their own reservations. It was during this time that Ojibwe children were sent to boarding schools and forced in that way to assimilate to European culture. And there were a series of laws, including the Dawes Act, which allotted on reservation land, which were then taxed. Any unallotted land was sold to non-Indians, and then as a result of some of this taxation issues, other lands were also sold to non-Indians, and that's why we see the reservations being checkerboarded, and the tribes are really trying hard to reacquire a lot of that land and get it back into their land base now. In 1983, the Voigt decision, the LCO case, reaffirmed the Ojibwe rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territories. allowed them to regulate the conduct of their members off reservation and co-manage ceded territory natural resources. Other court cases and other interjurisdictional agreements reaffirmed treaty rights in other locations throughout this time period and into the 1990s. After the court cases, there were protests and harassment against tribal members practicing their rights. This is also known as the Walleye Wars. You see the sign that the folks are holding up there. I went to Northland College in the early 1990s, and there was a guy down the street from me that had that exact sign on his porch. This organized protest eventually stopped, and with help from law enforcement and activists, but harassment continues to this day. Every year we have reports of particularly spearers, but sometimes ricers being harassed, sometimes even shots fired in their direction. And our wardens, GLIFWC wardens, and Wisconsin, the state DNRs and state and local police take these issues and incidents very seriously, and they're investigated, and people have been charged for this. From the late 1980s to the present, we have seen a resurgence of cultural practices and of the Ojibwe language, a recognition of indigenous knowledge systems as legitimate and equal to Western science, and attempts to correct racist histories such as renaming places, roads, and natural features. You see on the right there the cover of the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, which is another one of the things that we work on with a really large, diverse group of collaborators, helping tribes and their partners think about climate adaptation from a more indigenous and a holistic perspective. Hannah, is this where I pass it to you? No? Okay. So our climate change program started in 2014 with the goal of using a holistic approach to look at climate change impacts. And we try to do that the best way we can to integrate traditional ecological knowledge and Western or modern science, so that we're using both knowledge systems to approach some really wicked problems. When we think about traditional ecological knowledge, this term really encompasses a lot more than what science does. It's a completely different way of looking at the world, but TEK and Western science complement each other and often confirm each other. So when we think about TEK, we're thinking about things like culture and environment and lifeways, language and observations, truth, beings, change, and manadug or spirits. We'll talk about thinking about things like animals and plants as relatives instead of resources. And the perspective recognizes that these are beings, they're animate, they have spirits, they have instructions that they got from the Creator on their place in the world. And the perspective forces us to kind of recognize that they're not here, they weren't put here for us. And without them, we would cease to exist. But all of those other orders of creation would be fine without us. We recognize that tribes depend on culturally important beings to meet spiritual, ceremonial, medicinal, and subsistence and economic needs, and that all of these things are threatened by climate change. Now it's time for you.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Okay, so that brings us to our climate change program and our first task, which was this climate change vulnerability assessment. So the version on the left is version 1, which we produced in 2018. It's a short version. It has 11 of the beings that we looked at. And then our second version is on the right, which we just released this year. It's available on our website, and there's a QR code later in the presentation too. And so we just produced this vulnerability assessment this year. It has 68 different beings, all culturally important beings. From an Ojibwe perspective, of course, all all beings are important, but we had to draw the line somewhere for our assessment. Go ahead. So in the assessment, we attempted to integrate scientific ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, which is challenging to do, but this is how we approached it. We did a series of TEK interviews in each of our 11 member tribal communities. We sat down with elders, knowledge holders, youth, hunters, fishers, gatherers, and asked them about climate change. The interviews were semi-directed, so we gave them, we provided a list of questions, and the interviewees could choose to either answer those questions or share other knowledge that they chose. And so a lot of changes were brought up, not necessarily all related to climate change, but a lot of related topics. Go ahead. And I'll just point out that Melanie Montano is our TEK specialist and couldn't be here today, but she's the one that did most of the interviews, but Rob and I helped out with some of them. So we also used a tool called the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. It's an Excel-based tool produced by NatureServe, and it provides a pretty quick way to look at different aspects of a being's natural history and decide how exactly they might be vulnerable to climate change. So we were able to use scientific knowledge like journal articles and studies like that in this tool, and we also were able to plug in information from the interviews directly into the tool to come up with a vulnerability ranking. Go ahead. Right, and so both of those are included in the results, and then we included a lot of information directly from the interviews into our results as well. So here are the 68 beings that we chose for the assessment, all with their Ojibwe names here. Go ahead, Rob. Rob mentioned this already, but just to note that these, from an Ojibwe perspective, these beings are considered relatives and not resources. And so that just thinking about them as relatives instead of resources really shifts your mindset. Okay, go ahead. So we'll just go over a little bit of a snapshot of our results, kind of. We looked at 5 categories commonly used by Ojibwe people. So we have plants, crawlers, swimmers, four-leggeds, and flyers. And of those 5 categories, plants and swimmers were the most vulnerable. A lot of that has to do with their more limited ability to move across the landscape in response to these changes. Manoomin was the most vulnerable being in our assessment of all 68 beings that we looked at. Pretty much every way a being can be impacted by climate change, Manoomin will be impacted by climate change. So any logging up, in the watershed that rice grows in, or any other human disturbance on the shoreline or in the watershed, can impact Manoomin. Any changes in water levels, whether that's up or down. We had the storm in northern Wisconsin in 2016, and then another one 2 years later in 2018. Both of those were early in the spring, or spring, early summer, and a couple of those, a couple areas had entire rice beds wiped out in those storms. So when the plants are in their floating leaf stage, they're called, where the plants are just floating on the water, they're really sensitive to water level changes, and plants can be drowned in that phase. Severe storms, we're getting more intense storm activity. Just the storms themselves can damage rice plants because they're very sensitive. So, hail, wind can all damage plants. And then in addition, the water level changes. And, if the plants are just still in seeds and there's a big flood too, the seeds can be washed out of rice beds too. There's a lot of other beings that like to eat Manoomin in addition to humans. So Nickag or Canada geese like to eat rice in addition to swans. And there are a lot of places where Canada geese and trumpeter swans are increasing in number and can decimate a whole rice bed. Other non-local beings, cattails are one example, but a lot of other non-local beings just have a longer growing season now and can outcompete Manoomin. We'll see more diseases in the future. This is an example of brown spot fungus, which often spreads when the nights are warm and moist at night during the summer. And so we've seen a lot more brown spot fungus recently. Any dams can impact water levels and therefore affect manoomin. And then finally, ice cover is a big one, ice and snow cover. The seeds need a long, cold period in order to germinate. And so if we've seen decreasing ice on lakes, that will affect the seed's ability to germinate. So climate change is coming from manoomin in a lot of different ways. Go ahead. Okay. And I know a lot of people on here are interested in forestry, so I thought we would talk about trees a little bit. We did include 9 tree beings in our assessment. So the vulnerability is on the bottom here. So less vulnerable on the left, more vulnerable on the right. And then the color of the dot refers to the different categories that were in our assessment. So the green ones are less vulnerable, yellow, more vulnerable, orange are highly vulnerable, and the red dots are extremely vulnerable. So this is looking at a best case, the dot on the left, to a worst case scenario. We looked at 2 different climate change scenarios in our assessment. So best case, tamarack on the top, that's its Ojibwe name, Mashkigwatig. So best case, more vulnerable, and worst case, extremely vulnerable on the right. And if you look in our assessment, we have all of the beings in this kind of graph, so you can compare all of them. Okay, go ahead. I just wanted to go through the 3 trees that in the worst case scenario were listed as extremely vulnerable. So Mashkigwatig or tamarack, which people mentioned when we did interviews, are often the first thing to die off in a swamp. They're pretty vulnerable to water level changes. So that's what people were talking about in the interviews. And then we found, warmer temperatures as well. Yeah, the high water levels are flooding in addition to drought. Low snow cover can really impact tamarack when they're not protected by that snow in the winter. And then Maani-Doonsag is the name for insects. So a lot of different insects attacking Mashkigwatig right now. Okay, balsam fir in Onondaga, which we did have some people say in the interviews that there were places that balsam or in Onondaga is getting to be pretty rare. So it's also a northern being, affected by warmer temperatures. Drought can really impact it. Windstorms can uproot the plants, and then of course there are a lot of insects affecting it in Onondaga too. Maani-Doonsag. Kijigatig or northern white cedar is one that is really integral to the culture in a lot of places, and in some places people mention that they've had to try to find a different plant to use because they haven't been able to get cedar in their area, and had to try to find a substitute. So another northern being affected by warmer temperatures. And Kijigatig can grow in a lot of different places, but definitely can be affected by high water or low water levels. And then, of course, those Wawashkeshi or white-tailed deer really love to eat them. So if the low snow cover helps them out with that, then they will. Okay. So those were 3 of the trees that were extremely vulnerable. And we want to note that, many of these beings that we looked at in our assessment are vulnerable. But as Rob was mentioning earlier, the treaty rights are fixed in place and they can't move with the beings if they're moving north, if they're moving west, or out of the ceded territories. Waboos or snowshoe hare is one that was brought up a lot by tribal members. An elder in Redcliffe said that he has seen waboos. He used to harvest waboos, and now he's afraid that his grandkids won't even know what they look like. This is a Wisconsin study looking at waboos' range. So 1980, you can see their range dipped all the way down into southern Wisconsin. 2014, pretty much just the northern third of the state. And then projections showing that by 2050, they'll be retreating even farther north. And, you know, and then the ceded territory line goes through pretty much central Wisconsin. So there will be places where tribal members will likely not be able to find waboos anymore. Okay, and we wanted to share just a few audio quotes with you guys from across the ceded territories. So I guess, Lane, if you want to stop recording for this part. And so just to note that, you know, that information is very place-based that we've gotten from those interviews. You know, that knowledge has been developed over thousands of years of direct observation in order to survive. So when we do these interviews, we get a lot of very specific place-based information. And then when we combine that with that climate change vulnerability index, we get kind of a information on across the ceded territories and then information from each of the different tribal reservation areas. The other thing that was brought up a lot in these interviews that's changing rapidly is these phenological indicators. So when something happens, people know it's time to go harvest something else. And so one of these is when spring peak birds start calling, it's time for walleye season. So walleye start spawning pretty much as soon as the ice goes out. And that's happening a lot earlier. So these things aren't necessarily matching up anymore. Another one about fireflies that people brought up in interviews. Fireflies indicate that those Wawash Keishi will be coming around and are ready to be hunted, which people said was around July 1st. But I remember the last couple of years at least, I've seen fireflies in June. And usually when I bring that up, people volunteer that they've seen them very early in the year too. And then the last one to share is just as soon as papa leaves are as big as a quarter or beaver's ears, the suckers would run. And this one was brought up by people saying that for the past 15 or 20 years, this indicator hasn't been the case anymore. They haven't been matching up just in the past 15 to 20 years. So these indicators, again, have held true for thousands of years. People have been living by them, hunting, fishing, gathering, and surviving based on these indicators. And now with recent climate change, those things aren't matching up and the harvest cues aren't there anymore.
So we did all this work on the vulnerability assessment and what comes next. So if you look on the left side of the screen here, this is a list of a lot of the projects that we're working on in our climate change program. We have a couple different fisheries projects in Lake Superior looking at whitefish and lake trout in terms of what they eat and where they live. The phenology study that Hannah spoke about, looking at 10 or 11 different tree and low forest cover beings, trying to track when they leaf out and when they produce fruit and things like that to see if it's changing over time. A seed bank project where right now we're collecting wigwas or birch and Aanji-bimaadiziimagak or black ash seeds to hold for future use by the tribes. We do a lot of inland lake work with walleye or oga, wabazashi or American martin, the vulnerability assessment, the tribal adaptation menu, and a number of other projects. And all of these very sciencey, very Western sciencey projects that are infused with, integrated with TEK are going to go into eventually what's going to be a ceded territory climate adaptation plan that we're just starting to get our heads around now, how we take on 60,000 square miles of ceded land and all of the different beings that live there, all of the different habitats and ecosystems, and how we think about getting all of these things and people ready for changes that are coming. One of the things that we do know is that just as the vulnerability assessment was directed by the tribes and their needs and priorities, this adaptation plan will be too. So we'll be starting with a series of listening sessions with all of the member tribes so that we can ask them the question, what do you want the ceded territories to look like in 2100? And hopefully go from there. One last audio clip. With that, we would like to say, Miigwech Bizendawe, thanks for listening to us. The QR code at the bottom right on your screen will take you to a high-res PDF of the assessment that you can download. We also have physical copies available, so you can reach out to either of us. We can see what we can do about getting you a copy if you need one. And with that, I guess I can leave the slides up in case we have to go back to any, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Rob and Hannah. We do have a couple questions so far. Does your organization have the ability to expand with nations within the 1855 treaty area?
At this point, we don't. GLIFWC was specifically formed by the tribes in the 1836, 37, 42, and 54 ceded territories. It would probably take a lot of work to expand beyond that footprint. And that's not really a question for us to answer. That would be the tribal leadership who we work for.
Great. And although it wasn't included, do you have an estimate for the vulnerability of bur oak?
No, we don't. We did not look at bur oak and don't have a lot of it up here anyway. But I see that Lane put the link in the chat for the NIACS projections, so you could find that information there for sure.
Any other questions from folks in chat? And while folks are thinking and typing, I had a question about logging as it relates to, or logging activities as it relates to kind of mitigating the impact on Manoomin. Is there any strategies that you've seen or heard on the landscape for ways to still have logging activities while not damaging the resource? Whether that's in from the Minnesota perspective, like the forest management guidelines or other practices?
I don't have any specific examples. I know one of the things we work with the University of Minnesota group, and I can never remember the really long Ojibwe title of this group, but it's a collective, a collaborative that was includes the University of Minnesota, a number of tribal nations, GLIFWC, 1854 Treaty Authority, looking at Manoomin from a couple different perspectives, you know, physical and biological and social sciences. And one of the things that people are looking at are land use and land use changes and the impacts on Manoomin in hopes of developing some really good best management practices for things like logging. But, you know, in the interim, obviously riparian buffers are a really good thing. You know, if you can run machinery when the ground is frozen or dry and minimize the amount of sedimentation that's going into the streams, that's a big deal. And anything that serves to protect streams and lakes from hydrologic changes is important too.
And a couple more questions here. That's great work. Thank you. How do you recommend that land managers reach out to folks to begin to build relationships and understanding with tribal community members? I know many who would like to, but don't know where to start.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start and Robbie can chime in. One really good resource for this is looking at our tribal adaptation menu that we had a picture of earlier. So if you just search for tribal adaptation menu, you'll find it on GLIFWC's website. And there's a section in the menu called Guiding Principles for Working with Tribes. So if you read that, that really has a lot of good guidance in it. But I can summarize some of it. A lot of it is reaching out to tribes, early at the beginning of any kind of project that you're thinking about, and reaching out to the tribes directly. Some people like to reach out to GLIFWC as a substitute for reaching out to individual tribes, but it's always a good idea to reach out to individual tribes directly in your area, and start forming relationships and go from there.
All of the tribes have natural resources departments, and they're probably one of the easiest place to start. And then another important thing is recognizing that your area that you work in might be close to one or maybe two particular tribes, but if you're in ceded territory, depending on who the signatory to the treaties are, multiple tribes could have interest in that area. So you might need to expand your outreach beyond just kind of the closest one.
Great.
And we recognize that forming these relationships takes time and it's not easy. And really perseverance and humility go a long way.
Thank you. Question from someone on the Superior National Forest. I'm curious to know if there's any data related to impacts of aerial fire retardant applied during firefighting on Manoomin.
Oh, that was a really good question. Not that I know of, although there might be someone else at GLIFWC that could answer that question, but Rob's currently at a Manoomin symposium. Has that been talked about at all, Rob?
Not in front of me.
Okay.
It's a really interesting question, and I don't know if it's been asked before.
Great, maybe an icebreaker later in the day here at the conference.
It'll be an icebreaker for sure. I got a couple people in mind. I'm going to ask that question.
Great. And a comment I would like to add that I really appreciated the storytelling component to explain these beings in the handbook. It's a unique resource among technical documents on the subject. Another question, a long time ago in southern Wisconsin, I was involved with a phenology calendar using Aldo Leopold observations in comparison with current phenology observations. That might be a good example project to look at if the calendar produced annually by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Yes, we have seen that one. Yeah, that's a really good thing to point out. Thank you. And we do have GLIFWC does have a phenology calendar as well, like a wall calendar with some of our phenology observations that people can submit. So if you go to our website, you can enter your own observations, and then hopefully those can make it on calendars in future years.
And the 2024 version of our phenology calendar is out.
Great.
Yeah, and you can sign up to get the Mazanagan, our quarterly newsletter, for free on our website, and you'll get the wall calendar with that.
Great. Eli, if you're in the call, would you just mind posting the link to the GLIFWC site and maybe the calendar or the newsletter? In the meantime, any other questions from folks in chat here? Will this be an ongoing project with a new edition eventually?
Oh, that is a very good question. After working on it for 7 years, we're not exactly keen to update it, but we do see this kind of as a living document. So I'm sure eventually there will be updates to it. Yeah.
And there have been other things that tribal leaders have brought up to us that we weren't able to address in this particular version, especially things like spiritual beings, Monadug, and then the interaction between groundwater and magnetic mineral bodies is kind of a topic that one of our tribal leaders brings up on a regular basis. in terms of that being kind of the engine that keeps Lake Superior in particular being the climate refuge that it is.
Great, and I pasted a link for our attendees in the chat, so click on that link, same each month for the continuing ed credits for this webinar, and then Eli posted a link to the GLIFWC newsletter. If anyone's having trouble accessing the QR code for any reason, I will post a very long and convoluted URL for the assessment here in the chat as well. But with that, I'm not seeing any further questions in the chat. Thanks so much to Hannah and Rob for guiding us through this process and providing some much needed context too for why things are the way they are, even ahead of the vulnerability assessment. So I appreciate that. But with that, I will cut you all loose a little bit early here with some time to spare, and I'll paste the CE link again as well. So thank you all for showing up.